An Israeli drone strike near the Lebanon-Syria border has reportedly killed a prominent Syrian businessman.
The first foreign incursion, military incursion into Russia since World War II.
Hamas says Israel killed its political leader Ismail Haniyeh in an airstrike on Tehran.
Gold is back in fashion. Central banks around the globe are returning to the precious metal as geopolitical tensions increase. And many African nations are looking to build up reserves, too, as they look for stability at a time of growing uncertainty. And the price of gold is responding.
Gold continues, in terms of price, its march ever higher.
Gold is a great safe haven.
The spot price of gold touched $2,483.73 U.S. per ounce. That's its highest price ever.
Going to $3,000 over the next 12 months.
So what's behind the push for bullion, and will this trend continue?
So for the last few years, China's been doing something that hasn't been done ever in modern history, which is to relink gold directly to its currency. So in simple terms, China wants to rebuild how money works. This is probably the most interesting story that you're going to hear this year. Some people call this the debasement trade, but this is so much bigger than that. Here's what's happening. Over the last few years, the People's Bank of China has been the biggest buyer of gold in the world.
China and its allies buying gold and selling treasury bonds in order to damage the dollar's reserve currency status. Here it is.
And at the same time that they've been buying, China's also built something called the Shanghai Gold Exchange, which is already the biggest physical gold marketplace in the world. They just opened a new vault in Hong Kong, and they're building what's called the Gold Corridor, which is this network of vaults across the BRICS countries. And it will allow those countries that hold the yuan to trade them in for physical gold. That gives China's currency something that the dollar lost a long, long time ago: trust, right? Because gold can't be frozen, can't be printed, it's much harder to debase, and it can't default the same way that treasuries and dollars can. And as of July 2025 of this year, gold has officially been reclassified to what's called a Basel III Tier 1 asset. That means it now counts the same as cash or treasuries on a bank's balance sheet. So the theory is that the next step is that gold will be upgraded again to what's called an HQLA, a high-quality liquid asset. That one change is gonna unlock gold's full potential. That will let countries use it for something called repo and financing, which is the foundation of the entire financial system. China has been systematically solving all the problems that countries had with using their currency. What's about to happen to the world? There's a parallel financial system that's being built right now to compete with dollars. This gold-backed strategy will allow China to build a way to lend and to trade and to develop outside the dollar and outside the West. What's happening to gold right now and why? What China's gold corridor actually is and how it works, and how it's going to be used to fund the development across the entire world without ever touching the IMF. The trust that countries used to have in dollars. For example, around 70% of all the global reserves were once stored in US dollars. In other words, countries held their wealth in US treasuries, bonds, right? Because they were considered to be the safest assets on earth. But then that started to change sometime in 2022, because that's when the United States froze about $300 billion worth of Russia's foreign reserves. Now, regardless of how you feel about that politically, what it showed to the rest of the world was, if your reserves are held in dollars, they're not really yours to begin with. They can be seized, they can be locked, and we can just turn it off at the click of a button. So countries were like, okay, I have a question. If you can do that to a nuclear power like Russia, what happens then if we disagree with you next, right? So that's why this change started to accelerate, because there was this loss of trust for paper assets. Central banks around the world, especially in what are called emerging markets, started to lower their exposure to US assets, and they started selling off their treasuries, and they started buying gold instead. Check this out, this is fascinating. This is a chart of how much gold China has. For the longest time, you could see it didn't really move anywhere, kind of going sideways. They bought some, they sold some, they bought some, but as soon as President Trump started the tariff threats, the chart explodes, right? China starts publicly accumulating gold and locking it up in their vaults. It's the fastest pace of buying in modern history. It's being done on a scale that's publicly, this is important, publicly visible to the rest of the world. Because remember, China could easily be buying this stuff in private, but they're not. Because what that does is it telegraphs to all the other countries that, look at all the gold we've got. We could now get off of US treasuries. That gives us the ability to get off of dollars. According to Luke Rahman, in just a couple of months, gold's share of reserves on the balance sheet will surpass US treasuries. The dollar's share of global reserves have been falling to the lowest levels in decades. Officially, the People's Bank of China reports that they have about 2,300 tons of gold or so. But the real number is probably way higher. Places like Bloomberg Economics and JP Morgan and the World Gold Council estimate that China probably controls closer to 3,500 to 5,000 tons when you include the gold held by state banks and sovereign funds that aren't really publicly disclosed. Dollar ownership is going down, gold ownership is going up. There was another major breakthrough that happened to gold that not a lot of people know about. In July of this year, it became what's called a Basel III Tier 1 asset. For decades, gold was actually considered what's called a Tier 3 asset under the old Basel banking rules. If a bank held, let's say, $1 billion worth of gold, it could only count about half of that value on its balance sheet. The system was literally designed to make sure that gold stayed something that banks stored and did not use. But then Basel III came along and it changed everything. Gold was upgraded to a Tier 1 asset, which means that now banks can recognize 100% of its value. But here's the thing, you still can't lend against gold. You can't borrow with it. You can't use it for repo. By the way, repo is the short-term lending system that keeps the entire global financial system stable. It's where banks borrow from each other overnight using treasuries. It's complicated, but what it means is gold went from being a shiny rock to now a more valuable shiny rock with better accounting. Okay, but that's where China stepped in. Because the next level above Tier 1 is something called HQLA, which stands for High Quality Liquid Asset. These assets are so safe, so stable, and so liquid that banks can actually use them as collateral in financing. Now, those assets are basically US treasuries. It's the plumbing behind every loan, repo, and credit facility in the world. US treasuries are what's used for the whole system. If you're a country and you want to build, let's say, a port or a factory or a power grid, you got to go to the central bank and you got to say, hey, I need to borrow some money. And they'd be like, deposit some high quality liquid assets with us and then we'll lend you the money, right? Now, again, that collateral is mostly US treasuries, which is also why the US dollar has played such a big role in the world. It's the link to these treasuries. It is needed to borrow money. But imagine what would happen if gold was able to join that list. Gold would go from being a passive, shiny rock to a thing that could be used to borrow, to lend, and to fund infrastructure with, all without ever touching the dollar. If gold becomes HQLA, countries will not need dollars to finance their economies anymore. And that brings us to the BRICS summit that took place in May. So for years, China's been trying to convince the entire world, mostly the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, South Africa, to use the yuan in their trades. But everyone pushed back with the same question. China was like, will you guys use our currency, please? And they're like, okay, we'll use your currency, but would mostly just rather use the dollar. But out of curiosity, what are you backing it with? And China's like, well, we're backing it with our economy. We're the factory of the world. It's stable. But as an added perk, if you want, we'll let you convert your yuan to gold anytime you want. They're like, that's cool. Okay. But where's the gold going to be stored at? China's like, China. So all the other countries are like, no, we're good. Now, we've seen how that played out before with the US. We're not going to trust you to hold our gold. That was a conversation that was happening years ago. But at the most recent BRICS summit, China had a lot of brilliant ideas to solve a lot of the problems those countries had with using the yuan. So here's how China is going to get the developing world to use their currency. So the first problem that they've solved is trust. Because if you're India or Brazil or South Africa, you're not just going to take China's word that they're going to keep your gold safe, right? you want to see it, you want to touch it, and you want to store it somewhere that you could access. So China built what's now being called as the gold corridor, analog version of the blockchain. But instead of blocks verified by miners, it's a network of gold vaults verified by nations. Each vault is connected to the Shanghai Gold Exchange, the SGE, and it tracks every bar, its purity, its serial number, who owns it. So that one change fixes the problem of decentralization and trust, because the gold custody is now geographically decentralized. It's verifiable, redeemable, and auditable to an extent. Now, the second problem China had to solve was something called volatility, right? Because if you're going to use a commodity like gold as collateral for things like loans, trade, or financing, you can't have price swings every single day. You can't have something that a nation with, let's say, a ton of money could just manipulate the price of. So here's how they're going to solve that. They're solving it by using what's called a moving average to stabilize the settlement price instead of using what's called a daily price. In other words, instead of pricing gold by whatever it's worth this morning, instead they might average it out over the last 200 trading days. So whatever the price was on average over the last 200 days is the price. So that makes gold much more predictable, less volatile, and it smooths out the price risk for everyone using it. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting. This is what scares the US big time. China is going to use this network, this system that it's building, to build other countries that need financing. So think about Africa, for example. A lot of countries there are really rich in natural resources and commodities like gold.
Africa produces between a quarter and a third of the world's gold, with more than half of the gold extracted on the continent in 2022 coming from artisanal and small-scale miners.
But they don't have the infrastructure. Under this system, those countries will now be able to deposit their gold into the SGE, the Shanghai Gold Exchange, and then China, through something like the New Development Bank, which is the BRICS Bank, they'll be able to loan them yuan against their gold to build anything they like. Roads, airports, power plants, whatever. China then gets to finance the development of and build influence and help countries go around the West and around the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, all while using gold as this high-quality liquid asset. That's how gold gets to HQLA regardless of what the West wants. So gold goes from being just an expensive, shiny rock that sits in a vault to an actual financial instrument that you can lend against, borrow with, and build on. Officially, the US holds roughly 8 tons of gold, maybe more, which is at this time the biggest stash of gold in the world. But a big portion of it was stored and accounted overseas for decades, mainly in London. So bringing the gold back to the US is a way for it to prepare for this new potential system without flat out saying, we want our gold back because the dollar might not be around. So if gold does become a high quality liquid asset, if it's allowed to be treated like treasuries, then whoever holds it physically has real collateral power to fund the rest of the developing world so that it can exert its influence on it. On a practical level, right? What does that mean for gold's price? Some people say that in 5 years, we could see gold at double what it is today. So then the question is, how will this affect investors, and specifically something like Bitcoin? What we're seeing is a split. On one side, you have China and the BRICS building a world where money is again backed by something physical and old and something people can see and touch. And on the other side, you have the US, which is the world's biggest exporter of paper money. And if China's system is collateralized by gold, the US will eventually have to compete and counter with something that plays to its strength, which could also be its gold. It could also be technology. In other words, if China is pairing its currency with something like gold, then the US could one day be paired with stable coins or maybe Bitcoin. Because think about it, both give you the same purpose in different ways. Gold represents trust through time because it's thousands of years old, it's physical, it's slow, it doesn't change much. And Bitcoin represents trust through energy and math. It's digital, it's transparent, it's fast, it's borderless. It has its own advantages. China's system is about control and hard collateral. The US could also have an advantage through hard collateral, but openness. So for the first time in modern history, I think, we might be going into a world where governments have to compete for influence, for the better idea of what money is. And that's something that has never happened before in history. In the past, there was always one global standard, one world reserve currency. But now we can be going into like this multi-monetary phase of history where gold-backed money is led by China and BRICS, and the digital one led by the US and the West, built around programmable assets, tokenized assets, and maybe Bitcoin. If that happens, money then becomes something countries and people can choose. Both are competing for versions of what comes after the dollar. And I actually think both can exist at the same time. And when and if it happens, I think you could see both asset prices reprice very, very quickly. Now, when I say quickly, I don't mean this year. That could mean 5 to 10 years from now, which is still considered very quick on these scales. But who knows?